By the time the third plantation burned, no one asked how the slaves escaped. They asked who had shown them the way. In rural Georgia, around 1839, there were roads that never appeared on maps, paths that vanished the moment a white man tried to follow them, swamps that swallowed blood and returned bones decades later. And somewhere within those unseen corridors, there was a name, never written, never prayed aloud, only whispered by candlelight, as if sound itself might betray it. Plantation ledgers listed losses, tools, livestock, for bodies missing. But beside those numbers, planters carved symbols, crosses turned sideways, knots drawn in ink, marks not meant for accountants, but warnings to one another. Because the escapes weren't random. Entire families vanished overnight. Chains were found unlocked, folded neatly. Dogs refused to track. Overseers woke screaming from dreams where the land itself shifted under their feet. And every time, someone would say, "He showed them." No one could describe him the same way twice. Some said he was old. Others swore he never aged. A few claimed he walked with a limp, until he didn't. Churches prayed against him. Slave patrols hunted shadows. And plantation owners, men who believed they owned land and people, began sleeping with pistols under their pillows. This is not the story of a rebellion. It is the story of knowledge, of a man who knew every escape route in Georgia, and the terrible price of learning them. To understand why his name inspired fear, you must first understand the land. Georgia plantations were designed as machines of containment, fields cut like open wounds, slave quarters placed just far enough from the main house to hear commands, but not conversations, roads curved intentionally, disorienting those who didn't know where they led. Swamps bordered plantations like living walls. Owners believed escape was impossible, but they misunderstood something ancient. Long before plantations, the land already had paths, native trails, river bends, seasonal passages animals followed without thinking. These routes were erased from official memory, but not from the soil. Moss still bent the same way. Trees leaned as if remembering footsteps. Enslaved people noticed these things, and one man noticed all of them. He was first mentioned in an 1827 baptismal record from a rural church near the Oconee River. No name, just a note beside 3 adult baptisms. They were instructed beforehand. The preacher later claimed he never taught them. Plantation children reported seeing a man near the tree lean at dusk, always watching, never speaking. Overseers dismissed it as superstition. But slaves began disappearing without panic, without chaos. They left behind small signs, a folded leaf, a string tied in a specific knot, ashes arranged like arrows. This was not flight. It was guided passage. The man himself appeared in no census. No bill of sale recorded his purchase. No estate listed his death. Stories described him as enslaved, yet no one could name his owner. Some believed he was passed secretly between plantations as a tracker, someone forced to hunt runaways until he learned the routes too well. Others whispered something worse, that he had once been chained in a church cellar after teaching a woman to flee, that the church prayed over him for days until he stopped screaming, that afterward, he walked differently, as if something inside him had been rearranged. What is certain is this: he never ran. He stayed close to plantations, close to danger, close to knowledge, and he taught without writing, without maps. He used memory and ritual, a way of walking, a way of counting steps between shadows, a way of listening to frogs that only sang near safe water. Families who followed him survived. Those who tried alone often vanished. Plantation owners began to notice a pattern. Escapes happened after funerals, after baptisms, after church gatherings. Faith, they believed, was being used against them. By 1842, Georgia newspapers printed vague warnings. Agitators are operating among the Negro population. Slave patrols doubled. Rewards were offered, not for runaways, but for information. Then came the night that changed everything. On a plantation near Milledgeville, 17 enslaved people vanished at once. No tracks, no broken locks, just a Bible left open in the quarters, turned to Exodus. The owner went mad within a year. He claimed the man came to him at night, not in dreams, but awake, standing at the foot of his bed, pointing toward the woods. The owner shot at him. The bullets struck the wall. The figure remained untouched. After that, patrols stopped chasing runaways into certain areas. They said the land turned on you there. And always, in every account, there was the same ending. Once you know the way out, the plantation can never hold you again. In central Georgia, churches were not sanctuaries. They were instruments. White painted wood, tall windows, bells that rang not just for worship, but for control. Every plantation church was positioned carefully, within walking distance of slave quarters, so faith could be supervised. Sermons for the enslaved were different. Obedience was scripture. Silence was salvation. Heaven was promised later, never now. But something began to change inside those churches. Elders noticed enslaved congregants sitting closer together, heads bowed not in submission but in concentration. They hummed hymns slowly, stretching notes in ways that felt intentional. Pauses appeared where none were written. A preacher in Hancock County wrote in his journal, "They are singing instructions." He dismissed the thought, then crossed it out, because fear had already crept in. After services, enslaved families gathered near the tree line instead of returning directly to quarters. Children traced shapes in dirt with sticks, circles, arrows, broken lines. When questioned, they said they were copying church marks. And always, someone new seemed to already know where to stand, when to move, when to disappear. The man was never seen preaching, but he was always present when knowledge passed. Witnesses later agreed on one detail. He sat in the last pew. Not every Sunday, not every church, but often enough that people noticed when he wasn't there. He never sang loudly, never bowed when told, never met the preacher's eyes. White congregants claimed not to see him at all. It was as if their eyes slid away from him, unable to fix on his outline. But enslaved people remembered his hands. Rough, scarred, moving constantly, not nervously, but deliberately. He tapped rhythms on the wood. 3 slow taps. Pause. 2 quick ones. Always the same. Children learned the pattern before they learned letters. It meant, wait, then move. After baptisms, he would speak quietly to families, not giving directions, but questions. Where does water sleep here? Which tree does the wind avoid? Where do snakes refuse to cross? The answers formed a map inside the listener's mind. No paper, no proof, nothing patrols could confiscate. Just memory, passed mouth to ear, parent to child. Churches kept records, dates, names, confessions. Starting in the late 1830s, something strange appeared in margins, small symbols carved lightly into wood benches. Overlapping triangles, knots etched with fingernails, marks scrubbed away but never fully erased. Confessionals became dangerous places. Enslaved people stopped speaking their sins aloud. They knelt, remained silent, then left. Preachers complained of spiritual decay. They never considered strategic quiet. One church cellar held prayer meetings at night, supposedly supervised. But records show guards frequently fell asleep, always at the same hour. Later, it was discovered they had been given tea, herbs known to grow only near marsh edges. Herbs the man was known to collect. No one accused him publicly. They couldn't prove his presence. The escapes changed after that. Not young men alone. Not reckless attempts. Entire families vanished. But most disturbing of all, children led the way. A 7-year-old guided 12 people through a swamp without hesitation. A girl no older than 9 walked straight through a patrol route without looking back. When caught and interrogated, the children gave the same answer. We were shown where the land opens. Plantation owners panicked. They demanded ministers preach harder sermons. They restricted church attendance. They locked Bibles away. But the damage was already done. Because the man had never relied on books. He relied on inheritance of knowing. Fear eventually rots loyalty. In 1846, a preacher in Baldwin County broke. He wrote a letter to plantation owners, claiming to know the source of the escapes. He described the man vaguely, refused to name him, said only, "He is not teaching rebellion. He is teaching disappearance." The preacher offered cooperation in exchange for protection. That same week, the church burned. No one was inside. No bodies were found. But the pulpit collapsed inward, as if eaten from below. The preacher fled the county. And after that, churches stopped reporting unusual behavior. Not because it ended, but because they understood something terrible. The church was no longer in control. By the late 1840s, rumors claimed the man had died. Others said he had been sold south. Some swore they saw him buried. Yet escapes continued, unchanged in method, unchanged in precision, which led to the most frightening possibility of all. He had never been the only one. He had created continuation, a system that survived him. a way of seeing the land that could not be erased. Plantation owners stopped speaking his name entirely, because names give shape, and whatever he had become, shape was no longer required. By 1851, plantation records began to show an impossible detail. Children, too young to work, too young to be disciplined, were being listed as missing. Not lost, not sold, not dead, missing. Mothers claimed the children had simply walked away, not crying, not confused. They packed no food, left no note, yet they moved with certainty, as if something inside them had already memorized the land. White overseers accused parents of lying, but patrols found no trails. Because the children did not follow roads. They followed gaps. They stepped where grass bent unnaturally, where insects fell silent, where trees leaned away from something unseen. They crossed rivers at places adults would never consider, where stones hid just below the surface like waiting hands. An elderly enslaved woman told a visiting abolitionist, "They don't learn it. They remember it." That sentence was never published. The name, long buried, resurfaced only once in writing. In 1853, a doctor hired by a plantation near Macon was called to examine a boy found wandering alone. The child was uninjured, calm, and unusually observant. He refused food but drank water only after smelling it first. The doctor asked who showed him how to survive. The boy answered with a single word. The doctor froze. In his notes, he wrote, "The child spoke a name none dare use. I will not repeat it. My hand shook writing this." The page after that was torn out. Within a year, the doctor moved north. The plantation burned quietly, listed as an accident. The boy was never found again. Not all children escaped with family. Some were born into silence. Plantation orphan houses, rare, neglected structures, began reporting something disturbing. Children disappeared before learning to speak properly. Toddlers slipped from cribs. Infants left behind empty blankets. No cries, no blood, just absence. Caretakers insisted the doors were locked, windows barred, yet the children were gone. Local legends blamed animals, spirits, God, but enslaved elders knew better. They said the man came to those children first, that he showed them the land before the plantation could teach fear. That knowledge, once given early enough, did not need language. Plantation owners responded with force. They burned trees, drained swamps, cut new roads to confuse paths. They even relocated slave quarters to disrupt memory. It did not work, because the map was no longer physical. It was relational. A mother taught a child which stars were wrong. A father taught silence at certain crossroads. Grandparents told stories that sounded like folk tales, but were measurements, timing, warnings. The man had turned survival into culture, and culture cannot be whipped away. By the late 1850s, plantation owners no longer trusted each other. They accused neighboring estates of harboring the knowledge. Churches stopped sharing congregations. Patrols refused certain routes at night. One planter wrote to his brother, "I believe the land itself has chosen sides." He was found drowned weeks later in a dry ravine. His body showed no signs of struggle. By 1860, patience had run out. Plantation owners no longer believed brute force could stop the disappearances. So they turned to something more effective. Betrayal. A reward was quietly offered, not in newspapers, not publicly, but through whispered promises: land, freedom papers, protection. The offer was simple: deliver the man. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. Then one night, near a cypress swamp that patrols refused to enter, a signal fire burned too long, too bright, in the wrong place. The man noticed immediately. Witnesses later said he stopped walking, tilted his head, and smiled, not in surprise, but recognition. He had taught this lesson himself. When the land goes silent, someone has spoken. The trap closed fast. Riders came from 3 directions. Dogs, trained with herbs to ignore familiar scents, surrounded him. For the first time in decades, the paths did not open. Not because they couldn't, but because he chose not to run. They chained him in an abandoned courthouse cellar. Stone walls, no windows, iron rings embedded in rock. Planters demanded answers. How did he learn the routes? Who taught him? Where were the others? He said nothing. Days passed. He did not beg, did not curse, did not pray aloud. Guards reported strange behavior. The man slept sitting up, never fully closed his eyes. When spoken to, he answered questions with different questions. Do you know where your shadow goes at noon? Have you ever followed a sound instead of fleeing it? One guard quit after claiming the walls were moving, subtly, like breathing. Another swore the man's chains loosened at night, then tightened again by morning. No one could prove it. A minister was brought in. He attempted scripture. Threats of hell. Promises of mercy. The man finally spoke. Only once. You built hell carefully. I only found the exits. The minister later claimed those words ruined his sleep for the rest of his life. When pressed for names, maps, routes, the man shook his head. You are too late to unlearn it. That was when they understood. Killing him would change nothing. Official records claim he was executed quietly. No date. No witness list. No grave. But local accounts tell a different story. They say the rope snapped, twice. They say the crowd felt dizzy, disoriented, unable to recall how they arrived there. They say birds left the trees and did not return. And they say that when it was over, the body was gone. Only the chains remained, laid neatly on the ground. After that, escapes did not slow. They increased. The Civil War would soon tear through Georgia. Plantations would collapse. Laws would change. But the routes stayed. Even today, there are roads that dead end for no reason. Swamps that locals avoid without explanation. Churches built on land that refuses renovation. Elders still warn children. Listen to the land before it speaks. Because knowledge passed carefully never truly dies. And because somewhere between memory and soil, the man's work remains unfinished. When the war ended, Georgia changed on paper. Chains were removed. Laws were rewritten. Plantations fell into ruin or were renamed farms, schools, towns. But the land did not reset. Freed families returned to places they had once fled, not because they were lost, but because they remembered where it was safe to stand. Some built homes only where the ground felt open. Others refused entire stretches of land without explanation. Surveyors complained that measurements never aligned. Property lines curved unnaturally. Roads built straight slowly bent over time, as if following something older beneath them. County officials blamed erosion. Elders said nothing, because silence was still part of the lesson. By the early 1900s, children in certain Georgia counties learned strange habits. They counted steps between trees without knowing why, avoided specific crossings, refused to sleep near certain walls. When asked, they answered, "It doesn't feel right." Churches noticed attendance patterns that made no sense. Entire families avoided buildings constructed on former plantation land. Others only entered through side doors. A schoolteacher wrote in 1912, "Some children navigate the woods better than maps allow. They do not get lost. They get quiet." That sentence was underlined 3 times. The name, never written, returned one final time. In 1936, during a Works Progress Administration interview, an elderly man was asked about local legends. He laughed, then grew serious. He said, "You don't say his name unless you're trying to leave something behind." The interviewer pressed for details. The old man stood up and ended the session. The transcript ends abruptly. Modern highways in Georgia still contain anomalies. Dead ends in dense forest. Curves that engineers cannot explain. Swamps that swallow equipment overnight. Local crews refuse certain jobs, not out of superstition, but experience. They say machines break there. Compasses fail. Radios go quiet. As if the land still remembers being used and resists it. The man never wanted worship. He never wanted rebellion. He wanted knowledge to survive power. He taught that escape was not a single act, but a way of seeing. That freedom begins long before movement. That institutions collapse when people understand the paths they were never meant to see. And perhaps that is why his story remains unfinished. Because as long as there are systems built to trap, there will always be those who learn the exits. And somewhere in Georgia, when the woods go quiet and the ground feels open, you are standing on one of his routes.